Most of my learning has been done on the road, and I learned fairly early on. And I think probably reporting from the United States and reporting from Vietnam was a crucial part of my political education. Certainly an understanding, as the great journalist I.F. Stone said, that all governments lie and nothing they say should ever be believed. And I think that's a truism, actually, although my favourite quotation, which is from the great muckraker Claude Cockburn, who I think goes closer to the point: never believe anything until it's officially denied. And that is something I learned pretty early on. And so I have, which I believe should be part of the job of being a journalist, a very healthy skepticism of almost everything that we're told by governments or by officials or by vested interests. And in my experience, the evidence provided by ordinary people, if we call all of us ordinary people, but certainly in extraordinary circumstances, it has been reliable, and the evidence provided by governments has almost always unreliable. And I think, in answer to your question about expendability, because the media is an extension of the established order. I mean, we have a romantic view of it that, as Burke described it, as a fourth estate, and we're there to check all the other parts of government. That's all very nice, like US Constitution, which George Bush has just ripped up and thrown away. That sanctity of the fourth estate has always been a rather romantic one. In my experience, most mainstream media regard most other peoples in the world in terms of their usefulness. So we end up with worthy victims and unworthy victims. Worthy victims, Israelis; unworthy victims, Palestinians; worthy victims, Iraqi Kurds; unworthy victims, Turkish Kurds. And so it goes on. We end up with good tyrants and bad tyrants. Good tyrant, General Suharto, one of the great mass murderers of the 20th century, and bad tyrant Saddam Hussein, compared with Suharto's small beer. And that's really how governments think. So the media really echo. Double standards, like the expendability of some people and the acceptability of other people, that's the vocabulary, that's the language of power. It's not the language of us. And when I say we and us, I don't mean, as you hear journalists saying so often, when they mean we, they talk about the government. Well, do you think we should be doing this? They say, Minister. I think people, especially with the internet, are becoming far more discerning. You can't depend on the daily media. You can't depend on the daily press. You can't depend on broadcasting. You have to look elsewhere. My routine is to get up in the morning and log on, and I go through several websites that trawl the world's newspapers and overnight news and so on. Such is the wonder of the internet that I can go from the United States to India and to get a sense, but I can do it through 2 or 3 websites. Then I'll go downstairs and pick up The Guardian. Now, that's the order at the moment. It couldn't be. I don't watch television news, hardly at all. I mean, either only to monitor it or deconstruct it, and that's work, you know. Getting information from it is just pointless. And so that's my job, and it's not easy for people who are not journalists, although I think most people are pretty savvy about this now. I think there is a critical public intelligence that is so far ahead of the media that understands, broadly speaking, that the world isn't about tick boxes, that our government has a responsibility for much of what is happening in the world, that there are great myths like the war on terror. We're not at war, it's absurd. I think most people, in my experience, get that. But how you get detail of it and how you contextualize it is something that we need to work on, and I would suggest the internet is the democracy. The word has been such a noble concept, but has been terribly devalued. I mean, real democracy only ever came from extra-parliamentary activity. It came from the ground. That's not an opinion, it's there. We know it. You know, back to Cromwell's Model Army and through to the great Chartist movement of the 1830s and 40s, the movement that made the reform bills mean something. I mean, franchise was only won, universal franchise in 1929. How was it won? I would think the Chartists are the most interesting for me because they defined democracy as the three: political democracy, social democracy, and economic democracy. And without, what we have is political democracy in bits of the others. And we every 5 years we go and we're asked to go and ratify a form of democracy that I think is a long way from what democracy in its modern sense was intended to be. I've just been in Venezuela. It's very interesting because to hear Hugo Chavez actually quote the Charters and talk about the three elements of democracy, you never hear that in public discourse in this country now. It is not just about voting. In fact, the Charters actually said if the vote is simply to ratify the same power, then that's undemocratic. It doesn't mean you have democracy. And the Bush administration's idea of democracy and what it calls its project democracy is to have a vote as long as the country is totally enthralled and in hock to the IMF and the World Bank, which of course means the US Treasury, and they call it something called neoliberalism, which is capitalism in its most Hobbesian form. You know, that's democracy. Well, it isn't democracy. And what we have here isn't democracy, because the democracy that meant anything, that came to Britain, that was won by the British, came through struggle at grassroots level, and it came through, well, I don't need to run over the past again, but the past does teach us, and I think it's something that we have to consider, because this sentimental blackmail, emotional blackmail every 5 years can't go on, and that's one of Mr. Blair's, I think, great achievements, is that he's destroyed it. Because every 5 years we vote Labour again, please. Why? Why? You know, and the why has to become a huge national debate. Where it goes from there, I don't know. Modern history is very much a clash of imperial powers. But I think what is interesting about public opinion today as a power is that it's not accepting that. I've never known people to be better informed in all my years as a journalist than they are now. And that may even include a consciousness about how the world ought to be run. There's that terrible word, multipolar. I think they mean that it should be run by various states. Yes, the more powerful, undoubtedly, will have more power. But there's ways of restraining them. I think we're only at the beginning of really working out a truly democratic modern era. And that's for that reason I find some of the events in that benighted continent, Latin America, exciting, because they've come from the grassroots. They've come from the ground up in the same way that real democracy was nurtured in this country from the ground up. It's a long road ahead, but the idea that we should sit back and just accept some pundit or other or politician telling us that China's the next power, I don't think so.